To recap the previous video, our Choose One voting system has big problems. Because of spoilers and vote splitting, it can't handle elections with 3 or more candidates. It often elects weak candidates, and good candidates sometimes don't even run. It polarizes our society. Still, in defense of Choose One voting, it's the simplest voting method, and simple is really important in the real world. It was chosen hundreds of years ago, and over time we've figured out ways to patch it in an effort to fix the problems. This first slide shows some of the patches that are now widely used. The first patch is to make it more difficult to qualify for the ballot, because you want to keep splitters and spoilers off the ballot. The United States has made it very difficult for candidates to be listed on the ballot. The second patch is to have primaries to narrow the field. If you can get the field down to 2 candidates, then Choose One voting works well. The problem with this patch is that vote splitting in the primaries causes candidates with low approvals to get through to the final election. Also, this approach still lets third-party candidates get through, and it requires a separate election. The third way is to have runoffs when no one gets a majority. Here again, a vote split in the first election will allow an unpopular candidate to get through to the final election. A fourth patch is used in about a dozen cities around the U.S. It's called instant runoff voting because it requires the voter to specify ahead of time how they would vote if a runoff is required. Instant runoff voting can be hard to analyze, so I'm going to devote a few slides to it. Instant runoff voting was invented about 150 years ago with the idea of eliminating runoff elections. The voter is asked ahead of time how they would vote in a runoff if the first election doesn't produce a majority winner. The process continues because the voter is also asked how to decide how they would vote in a second runoff if the first runoff doesn't produce a majority winner, and so on. On the ballot, the voter does this by ranking the candidates from first to last in a spreadsheet. I'll describe the method by talking about the state of Maine elections. Here are the results of the last 10 gubernatorial elections in Maine that were held with regular Choose One voting. In only 2 elections was there a clear majority winner. Vote splitting and spoilers occurred in 8 of the elections. In 2016, the voters were fed up and passed a referendum that converted them to instant runoff voting for the primaries. Here's what their ballot looked like in the Democratic primary. The Democrats had 7 candidates in their primary. You also get a write-in candidate, so the voters were faced with an 8x8 spreadsheet to complete. If there had been 27 candidates, like the recent California governor's race, then the spreadsheet would have had 28 rows and 28 columns. Completing the whole spreadsheet without mistakes takes effort. The next slide has a list of the pros and cons of instant runoff voting. The first pro is that instant runoff voting reduces vote splitting. Second, it has the comfort factor of having been used in Australia for 100 years, although Australia has many rules that make comparison difficult. Like the name implies, it saves the cost of runoff elections. The cons start with complexity. The voter is asked to fill out a spreadsheet for hypothetical situations. The next con is that it doesn't really stop vote splitting. It just shifts the problem, just like regular runoff elections do. Instant runoff voting is not precinct summable. That means that each precinct can't tabulate their own results. Finding a winner requires access to all the ballots. This prevents the precincts from checking the accuracy of the central vote counters. One of the big cons is that voting for your favorite can cause him to lose. This is a side effect of vote splitting and takes about 4 minutes to explain. One of the videos in the bibliography covers this effect fully. Variations on instant runoff voting are used in San Francisco, Berkeley, Minneapolis, and some other cities. It's been tried and repealed in Aspen, Colorado, Cleveland, Ohio, Burlington, Vermont, and some other cities. As you can expect, politicians have opinions on it. Here are the opinions of 2 California politicians. Governor Jerry Brown thinks that it's too complicated, and Governor Gavin Newsom thinks that the cure is worse than the disease. My own opinion is that instant runoff voting is complicated, but it's still superior to choose one voting. It would be a good choice if there weren't any other choices. But there are other choices, and I'm going to describe 2 that are widely used. The internet almost never uses choose one voting or instant runoff voting. Its most common method is score voting, which Amazon, Yelp, Netflix, and Google use. Typically, you assign each candidate a score from 1 to 5 stars, and the system averages them. The one with the highest average score wins. This is also the way the Olympics decide a winner. Here are the pros and cons of score voting. First, score voting does prevent vote splitting and spoilers. It is moderately simple, and it doesn't require a change in your voting machines usually. You don't have to be afraid that voting for your favorite will cause her to lose, and third parties get some indication of how much support they have. On the con side, score voting is just moderately simple. It's still not as simple as choose one voting. The second con is that voters tend to game the system and vote either 5 stars or no stars. In that case, score voting becomes approval voting, which I will cover next. Approval voting is score voting with just a single level. Instead of 5 stars, you get 1 star, which is called an approval. The candidate with the most approvals wins. An approval ballot looks just like a regular choose one ballot, except the words vote for one are replaced with the words vote for one or more. That simple change solves the vote splitting and spoiler problems and reduces the polarization in American politics. Approval voting is used in the United Nations, the Vatican, and for 500 years in the city of Venice. You've used approval voting if you've ever clicked a like button or participated in a doodle poll. Here's a list of the pros and cons of approval voting. Going down the pros, the first is a must. Any new system must solve the vote splitting problem. Approval voting is the simplest of the alternative voting methods. That's why it might be preferred to score voting. It's so simple you don't need new voting machines. You don't have to fear that voting for your favorite will cause her to lose. You can vote for a third-party candidate without fear of spoiling the election, and third parties get a measure of their support. Counting votes is easy and can be done in each precinct, which reduces mistakes and fraud. The first con is that it's currently only used in one U.S. city, Fargo, North Dakota. The Fargo citizens had to overcome a lot of pressure to be the first U.S. city to try a new idea. The second con is that each voter doesn't get to express her degree of approval, which makes some voters uncomfortable. So, for instance, you may approve of both Nieder and Gore, but you don't get to say which one you like the best. The system relies on having a statistical spread in what the voters call approval. That problem is reduced with score voting, but then score voting is more complicated. What's amazing is that approval voting works so well while being so simple. So that's my overview of voting methods. The next section is on how to learn more. First is a book devoted entirely to approval voting. It gives the history of it as well as the theory that compare it to other voting methods. There's also a YouTube video of a panel discussion called 40 Years of Approval Voting Research. It features Nobel laureate Roger Myerson. For those that like podcasts, there's a 2-hour discussion of voting methods on the 80,000 Hours podcast. It features Aaron Hamlin of the Center for Election Science. For a description of the problems with instant runoff voting, see the SJ Voter channel. Also, don't forget Wikipedia. It's still a great source of information. And the final slide shows a website with a huge amount of information on voting methods. It's maintained by the Center for Election Science, which is a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization. They work with political scientists and statisticians to find well-founded methods for improving our elections. Currently, most of their energy is going towards finding replacements for our Choose One voting method. Thanks for watching.